2 decades ago, 4 newborns were cast aside, abandoned by the very people meant to protect them. Rejected at birth simply because they didn't look like their parents, their lives began with silence instead of love. Everyone thought their future was lost, but fate had a very different plan. What followed would defy every expectation and leave the world asking, what truly makes a family? Stay with us to the very end, and don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit subscribe for more powerful narratives that will stay with you. It began at Summit Valley Medical Center on the edge of Fort Collins, Colorado, where winter sunlight spilled across polished floors and early morning nurses swapped night shift notes in hushed voices. The delivery was intense but expected to be unremarkable. Quadruplets, scheduled, monitored, every minute documented. A boy arrived first, followed by 3 girls, tiny and tightly swaddled, skin a deep, lustrous brown that made the overhead lights look gentle. Nurses smiled and whispered the usual blessings. Nurses whisper when a room fills with the sound of new lungs. Beyond the curtain, forms waited to be signed, and bands waited to hold names. Everything was ready for an ordinary celebration of an extraordinary birth. The moment the parents saw the babies, the air changed. The father stiffened in disbelief. The mother turned her face toward the wall and the small routines that normally carry a family across the threshold of before to after simply collapsed. Staff did what training tells them to do: offer reassurance, present explanations grounded in medicine, bring calm to the center of the room. But no one could soften a decision that had already hardened. A request for a DNA test followed that evening. The results returned the next day as clearly as lab results ever return, biologically theirs, all 4. The genetics team explained what most people never need to understand: that distant ancestry can surface without warning, that recessive traits have long memories, and that rare does not mean impossible. The science persuaded the chart more than it swayed the heart. By sunrise, the hospital had reported the situation as required by law. Child welfare representatives stepped into the hallways that smell of antiseptic and coffee, asked careful questions, wrote careful notes, and opened a case no one had expected to open. An emergency hearing convened in a small room where the clock ticked too loudly. Psychological evaluations documented acute distress. A judge weighed the competing truths that sometimes crash into each other in modern life: what the law allows, what the heart can hold, what the community might do if it knew more than it should. Parental rights were relinquished under a protective order that sealed identities to prevent harm. The couple left with their names hidden behind legal ink. The 4 newborns stayed in a quiet row under the steady warmth of a nursery lamp. Nurses took turns offering what they could offer: long, steady holds, gentle pats that teach, a body the rhythm of tenderness, lullabies that barely rose above the hum of machines. Infant A, Infant B, Infant C, Infant D, read the temporary bands, a small bureaucratic mercy that protects until something more personal can be written. Word traveled like all hard news travels, carefully at first, then clumsily, then everywhere at once. Was it true? Were the babies healthy? Had fear really been stronger than attachment? People argued theories with the certainty of those who didn't have to decide anything, but the truth was plainer than any speculation. 4 children existed. They needed a home. They would not name themselves. 2 hours south, in the town of Larkspur, a house held its breath. Tiana and Malcolm Reed had built a small nursery in the hope that fortune would meet them halfway: fresh paint, a crib assembled on a Saturday, a mobile that had not yet spun above any sleeping face. They had tried clinics and calendars, prayer and patience, and had come to know both the vocabulary and the silence of infertility. When a social worker called with the facts: 4 healthy infants relinquished. At birth, immediate placement needed. Their quiet became motion. They drove before sunrise, hands linked across the console, the highway a strip of graphite that seemed to know where they were going better than they did. In the hospital ward, the boy settled against Malcolm's chest with the unself-conscious relief of someone who recognizes warmth, and one of the girls pressed her palm against Tiana's collarbone as if measuring the width of a promise. Paperwork began, because paperwork always begins when love is about to do something permanent. Home studies unfolded, background checks clicked forward, inspectors peered beneath sinks and into outlets, and at each checkpoint, The Reeds answered questions with the steadiness of people who had already decided what kind of parents they would be. The day custody was granted, a nurse arranged 4 swaddled bodies across Tiana's lap. Awkward, crowded, perfect. And Malcolm couldn't stop laughing even as tears kept brimming. They drove home under a broad, cold sky that seemed larger than it had looked the day before. On the living room floor, they spread out 4 new blankets with stitched constellations and spoke names that felt both chosen and discovered. The boy became Rowan, because the sound carried calm. The next girl became Sarah, whose yawn looked like a small refusal to hurry. The third became Naya, the first to kick free of a blanket and announce herself. The smallest became Maya, whose eyes tracked everything before anyone else seemed to notice that there was anything to track at all. The house, which had been practicing hope, finally got to live it out loud. Inside, routine settled in. Midnight bottles traded like relay batons. Socks drying. On the heater vents, lists on the refrigerator that conquered chaos with ink. Outside, the world performed its familiar, clumsy curiosity. Strangers asked if the children were theirs, then asked again as if the first answer hadn't counted. Neighbors stared a moment too long and apologized a moment too late. Church bulletin boards posted meal trains with casseroles that arrived warm and questions that arrived warmer. The Reeds learned to answer without performing, to educate without auditioning, to close the front door and return to the only truth that mattered. This family would be built with the materials at hand: love, time, repetition, and the refusal to leave. The children grew into the names that held them. Rowan arranged his blocks into quiet cities and spent long minutes watching light travel across the hardwood floor. Sarah leaned into books, not because she understood all the words yet, but because she sensed they kept their promises. Naya developed a cheerful defiance that made rules feel like challenges to be met with precision rather than avoided. She looked adults in the eye when they hesitated and made space for herself without asking first. Maya wrote early small letters that wandered across scrap paper, half poems tucked into couch cushions and the bottoms of drawers. Love cannot shield a child from every message a careless world sends, and the children heard echoes of difference whenever they left the house, but home taught them a second story that spoke louder. You belong here, and the belonging is not fragile. School widened their world and sharpened its edges. A teacher stumbled over roll call and blinked one beat too long. A cashier asked again whether the family was helping the children. A church acquaintance said they were such a blessing in a tone that felt too much like treating people as projects. The Reeds answered what they could and let pass what they couldn't. But children metabolize atmosphere as much as instruction. Questions accumulated in the spaces between dinner and dishes, between homework and bedtime, between what is said and what is shown. Why don't we look like you? Why didn't the people who made us keep us? Did we do something wrong before we knew what doing anything even meant? Tiana kept a small chair in the laundry room and cried there sometimes, where the hum of the machine disguised the sound, not because she lacked answers, but because the answers she had were not large enough to fill the silence their children were naming. Malcolm learned to distinguish problems that required a tool from questions that simply required presence. They practiced a kind of steady honesty that never promised what it could not deliver and never withheld what a child had a right to know. The records were sealed. The early choices had been made fast and locked quickly. The system would not help them find names to match the ache. By 17, each child carried the same mystery differently. Rowan learned the meditative patience of long runs and slow music, and stared out windows as if distance might volunteer a reason. Sarah read everything she could find on inheritance and identity and the ways families name themselves. Facts gave her solid ground, even when they could not tell her why. Naya threw her energy into making the spaces she entered kinder than she found them, volunteering, mentoring, finding younger kids who needed someone to choose them that day. Maya filled notebooks and hid them, her handwriting moving from careful print to confident script as she taught herself to pour feelings into sentences that would not flinch. The decision to search did not explode, it gathered. One evening, after dinner had been cleared, and the house felt honest in that quiet way homes do when their people are not performing for each other, Sarah closed a textbook and said what everyone already knew: the space between what they had and what they needed was not going to shrink on its own. Searching would not subtract love from the home they had. It might add understanding to the lives they were living. Rowan nodded with a relief that came from hearing his private hopes spoken out loud. Naya agreed with the kind of certainty that had always defined her. Facing a truth is easier than being chased by it. Maya lifted a wrist and then lowered it, a small motion that meant she had already written 10 drafts of this moment in her head. They started where modern searches often start, with what the state would release, with what a courthouse clerk might overlook, with what could be learned without breaking any rules, and without asking anyone to betray a trust. A case number surfaced in a digitized docket after a long afternoon of careful catalog. Searches redacted but not erased. A filing date aligned with their birth. Date. A sealed order bore a judge's initials that matched a news clipping from 20 years ago about unusual proceedings that raised questions around privacy. None of it said a name. All of it pointed to one. DNA kits entered the picture, not as a sly shortcut, but as one tool among many. The 4 of them swabbed, registered, waited, and tried not to project too much onto the spinning dots on the screen. Distant matches trickled in, third cousins whose family trees stretched back to towns. In Missouri, an aunt by marriage who seemed to know nothing beyond her own branch. A second cousin in Wichita opened a door wider than the others, not because she knew the story, but because she kept meticulous notes about every line she could trace and was generous with her afternoons. Her records intersected with a family named Grayson who had once lived near Fort Collins, and who had, within a year of the Quadruplets' birth, sold a house and moved southeast. The Graysons were not a myth. They were public records stitched together with the patience of 4 determined young adults and the help of one amateur genealogist who loved a puzzle. A marriage certificate and a city directory entry placed them in a suburb outside Atlanta. An alumni magazine noted a career move. Property records confirmed a current address. The facts were unromantic and precise, which is often how truth arrives. When people have been waiting a long time for anything solid at all. The Reeds did not gather a committee to decide what to do next. They trusted their children to know when to step forward. The 4 wrote a carefully worded letter, direct, respectful, unadorned by accusation. They did not ask for apologies. They did not offer absolution. They asked for the one thing that had been denied them since the first hour of their lives, an explanation they could set beside their own story and choose how to carry. They mailed it with a tracking number and spent the next days working, sleeping, pretending to be nonchalant, and failing at pretending. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived with a return address written in a steady hand. Inside was a brief reply that made no claims and did not attempt to defend anything. If you want to meet, we will. Meet, we can tell you what we can. We do not expect anything from you except the chance to speak plainly. The 4 read it once together at the kitchen counter, then again separately in their rooms. Then again in the hallway, where they somehow met without planning to meet at all. They chose a neutral place, a botanical garden just outside Atlanta, where the air would be public and the benches forgive poor posture. The meeting did not provide dramatic lines to be replayed later. It provided context. The people who had left them were not monsters or martyrs. They were ordinary, which made the harm feel both smaller and harder to excuse. Fear had met community pressure in that delivery room and found no one to interrupt it. Shame had mistaken itself for prudence. A decision had been made too quickly and protected too completely by laws written for different kinds of cases. Rowan listened without rescuing. Sarah asked precise questions that never sharpened into cruelty. Naya kept her arms crossed until they didn't need to be crossed, and Maya observed with the same quiet intensity she had practiced since she learned to hold a pencil. No one pretended that an origin story spoken at a garden table could repair 20 years of not speaking. What it did do was give shape to the unknown. The 4 learned that nothing they had done as infants had triggered abandonment. They learned that fear can masquerade as logic and find support in places that claim to cherish families. They learned that some regrets grow like vines and some cut cleanly but never quite close. They stood not as supplicants but as historians of their own lives, collecting the facts that belonged to them and refusing to let anyone else decide what those facts should mean. They left with no promises and no need for them. In the parking lot, they allowed themselves the small ritual of leaning on each other the way they always had, shoulders touching, breath steadying, silence now gentler than the silence they had carried before. Back at the hotel, they called the Reeds and told the story once in a stream and once again in a more coherent order. because telling it two different ways was part of how their family worked through anything hard. Tiana listened with the patience of someone who knows the difference between being in charge and being there. Malcolm listened with a hand against his chest as if making sure his heart was keeping up with what he was hearing. Returning home felt less like closing a chapter and more like stitching 2 pages together so they would not blow apart in a draft. The town was the same. The grocery store still placed the cereal too high on the shelf. The church still sang the same verse too loudly on sunny mornings. But the 4 moved through familiar rooms with a new steadiness. Rowan took his long runs without checking his phone as often. Sarah read case law not because she needed answers, but because she had found a field that turned questions into work and work into protection for other families. Naya expanded her mentoring program and found ways to make bureaucracies say yes faster. Maya turned her journals into essays that traveled beyond the house and returned, with letters from strangers who felt less alone because she had been specific. Graduation arrived in a tide of gowns and programs and the smell of flowers. The 4 stood together at the edge of a football field, with heat rising off the artificial turf and the future doing its usual trick of looking both vast and routine. Rowan had a place in a conservatory where composition still begins with silence. Sarah had a scholarship to study law with a concentration that would bear the marks of a life spent calling sealed doors by their proper names. Naya had a position at a youth center that paid less than she deserved and gave more than most jobs can give. Maya had a small publishing contract and a set of deadlines that made her feel like she had found a way to turn private courage into public craft. Tiana and Malcolm sat together in the front row of the bleachers with programs crumpling in their hands and the kind of pride that makes a person look both older and younger at the same time. They had spent 2 decades practicing a daily love that rarely earns applause and never needs a spotlight. The children, no longer children, waved without breaking stride, and the gesture was enough. We see you. We know what you did. We carry it into rooms you may never enter. After the ceremony, the family gathered at the same dinner table that had held so many conversations, some easy, some impossible, all honest. They ate the kind of meal that does not ask to be remembered and will be remembered anyway. They told stories that everyone had heard before and listened as if hearing them changed what happens next. With the dishes stacked and the window cracked to let in the evening air, the 4 named what had become clearer since the trip. They were not defined by the day they were left or by the people who left them. They were defined by the ones who stayed and by their own stubborn commitment to choose each other forward. Understanding had not erased pain. It had given it edges and a place to rest. Identity had become less a riddle and more a tapestry, the threads visible, the pattern theirs to interpret. In the months that followed, life resumed the rhythm that actual lives prefer, moving forward in increments while holding on to what must not be dropped. Rowan's compositions collected small audiences who closed their eyes at certain phrases because they felt invited to rest. Sarah clerked in a clinic that handled family cases and learned the contours of good lawyering from people who still sent her home in time to sleep. Naya measured success not in headlines, but in the names of teenagers who showed up 2 days in a row when they had never done that before. Maya's first book made its way into libraries, where someone who needed it would pull it from a shelf on a day that had not begun well and feel for 5 minutes steadier. The gossip in town did not disappear. It rarely does, but the power it once held dissolved in the face of a family that had long since learned how to build its own weather. Questions still came from strangers who felt entitled to origin stories. Answers still came from people who no longer owed those stories their precious energy. The Reeds and their 4 did not need the world to understand what they had built in order to keep building it. They needed only the daily choice to return to the table, to the work, to the ordinary tasks of keeping love alive. If you've walked with them this far, you already know what the story has been saying all along. Blood can begin a life, but love chooses it, guards it, expands it into something that can be handed down. Family is not a test that must be passed at birth. It is a practice lived in. Kitchens, cars, waiting rooms, and parking lots after hard conversations. Tell us what family has meant in your own life and where you're watching from, because naming it out loud gives courage to the next person who needs to hear it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs a reminder that real love does not audition, it shows up. and come back for the next one. Until then, take care. Hold close the people who choose you, and remember, you were never the mistake. You were always the home somebody kept building. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.